Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Thursday the 17th of November and this is Scotland at 7. I'm Andrew Wilson and this evening I'm hosting the programme from Edinburgh. First we will have today's coronavirus updates, then I will introduce this evening's guest, and then we will look at today's news headlines from Scotland and around the world together. As of 2 p.m. today, since the start of the pandemic, a total of 3,545,103 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and the UK Government regional testing centres. Of these, 2,853,164 have been confirmed negative, and 691,939 have tested positive. There are 3,360 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. Of the people who have tested positive, 774 were in hospital last night, 57 of whom were in intensive care. There are 13 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive, and that means that the number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 9,419. Now remember, this number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. The latest UK daily figures show that 143,360 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, and that's an increase of 201 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. And as of 8 a.m. this morning, 4,332,835 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,931,709 had received their second dose. As it's Wednesday today, we also have the weekly National Records of Scotland update. As at the 14th of November, 11,933 deaths have been registered in Scotland, where the coronavirus was mentioned on the death certificate, according to the statistics published today. Between the 8th and the 14th of November, 115 deaths were registered that mentioned COVID on the death certificate, and that's 25 fewer than the previous week. Of the deaths involving COVID in the latest week reported, 57 were female and 58 were male, 60 were aged 75 or older, 32 were aged 65 to 74, and 23 were under 65. There were 1,327 deaths from all causes last week. That's 222, 20% more than the rolling 5-year average. And analysis of deaths occurring between March 2020 and October 2021 shows that after adjusting for age, people living in the most deprived areas were 2.5 times as likely to die with COVID-19 as those living in the least deprived areas. The size of this gap has widened from 2.1 to 2.5 over the period of the pandemic. Now, we're lucky enough to be joined this evening by a long-term friend and regular contributor, Professor John Robertson. Before he was lucky enough to retire, John was the Professor of Media and Politics at the University of West of Scotland. Now he's a noted writer, blogger and campaigner. So John, how is Frankie Boyle's #1 fan doing this evening?
Yes. I'm a long-term lover of Frankie Boyle. I've loved his biting wit over the years. I think I put him second to Noam Chomsky in influence on me, but he's been really disappointing recently. Really disappointing. I mean, these tired, lazy sort of jokes about Nicola Sturgeon's appearance. I think he's got some nerve. Has he got a mirror at home?
Well, we'll try and be a little bit depressing and a little bit more of the moment this evening, if possible. Now, our first story is that UK inflation has increased to its highest level in a decade, hitting a rate more than double the government's target amid a severe cost of living squeeze from soaring household energy bills. The Office for National Statistics said the Consumer Prices Index measure of annual inflation rose to 4.2% in October, up from 3.1% in September, and that's the highest rate since November 2011. Driven by a dramatic jump in household gas and electricity prices, The figure was higher than forecast by City economists, with the annual inflation rate more than double the 2% target set by the government for the Bank of England. The increase will put pressure on the bank to raise interest rates from as early as next month, amid growing concern over the cost of living. The SNP has challenged the UK government to get a grip of the cost of living crisis, which they say is hammering households and leaving families worse off. The SNP's Alison Thulis warned that the perfect storm of UK government cuts, tax rises and soaring cost of Brexit was delivering a hammer blow to households, and that the statistics must serve as a wake-up call for the UK government to act and deliver meaningful financial support to tackle the cost of living crisis. So, John, this cost of living rise at the moment has nothing whatsoever to do with wage inflation, of which there's been almost none for more than a decade, and seems to be everything to do with energy costs. So is the potential of a rise from 0.1% to 0.2% in the base lending rate, is that going to make one whit of difference? Except perhaps it will encourage lenders to increase their charges, making things even more difficult for hard-pressed families.
Well, I think it would have been naive to, well, it was naive by experts to think that after an experience of some events like Brexit settle in as they actually start to have effect, and to have a pandemic, a global pandemic, that wouldn't destabilise the economy. I think that's pretty naive, and that's now happening in quite a dramatic way. Although I think maybe overstated. I'm sure I'm not. Again, I'm not something else. I'm not an historian, but I'd imagine there have been maybe you should ask Neil Ferguson. I'd imagine there have been previous incidents where something like a pandemic or some kind of major change in economic dealing has led to dramatic changes in, for example, in inflation. So I think it could be overstated. There's a lot of media interest in this, but all kind of expected, really. I think after the kind of disruption we've had.
I think that's very fair to say, John. So we've got the energy price cap going up, increased VAT being restored on hospitality businesses, used cars and clothing costing more, and fuel prices hitting another record high. And I think also rents are rising at their fastest rate in 13 years. So it feels perhaps that the scale and the scope of the cost of living crisis is widening at the moment in the absence of government doing anything to address it. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly going to affect people, and disproportionately, it's going to affect those who earn less, and those on benefits are clearly going to suffer this Christmas. That's a very, very worrying tendency. I think some of the effects on business are being dramatically overstated with the help of the mainstream media. I mean, we have the constant exposure to people from the hospitality industries telling us how they're going to have I think it was an avalanche that we're going to have rather than tsunami, an avalanche of cancellations, that kind of thing. When you look at the statistics, you see insolvencies are actually really very low at the moment. They're half what they were before the pandemic, and they're about a third of what they were 10 years ago. So I think businesses are surviving far more than they might suggest to us.
As ever, John, thank you for introducing what can only be described as data and facts into the conversation, in perhaps in contrast to the expert virologists and epidemiologists who seem uniquely to all work behind bars in Scotland. So thank you for that, John. We'll move on to our next story now, and that is that an official Chinese newspaper has weighed in on an alleged spat between the British Foreign Secretary and the UK's ambassador to China, suggesting that Liz Truss was a radical populist, and quoting Chinese internet users calling the UK Little Britain. The alleged row between Truss and Ambassador Caroline Wilson, the British ambassador to China, was first reported by The Times earlier this month. A Truss ally reportedly recalled a conversation last year between her and Wilson, who, according to the source, asked why the UK could not treat China like we treat the French. Because the French aren't committing genocide, responded Truss, a reference to China's treatment of the Uyghur population in its far west region of Xinjiang. On Saturday, the Mail on Sunday alleged that Wilson had sent letters to ministers who attend the National Security Council meetings to effectively argue for the appeasement of China. The article said the move risks putting Dame Caroline at odds with Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, one of the most hawkish members of the cabinet. The Foreign Office said it does not comment on leaks and said that decisions at the National Security Council are made by those ministers attending and not by officials. When Truss was an education minister in 2014, she visited Shanghai to learn about how Chinese pupils studied maths. She also oversaw the signing of a memorandum of understanding between the UCL Institute of Education and Hanban, the Beijing-based Confucius Institute headquarters. In June that year, she gave a speech at the Confucius Institute saying that the Chinese Link program and its network of Confucius classrooms will put in place a strong infrastructure for Mandarin in the UK. Last year, as Trade Secretary, Truss backed plans to give the British courts a role in determining whether genocide was happening in Xinjiang, a move reportedly opposed by the Foreign Office. This week, in response to the Foreign Affairs Committee's report on Xinjiang, the government said that it is long-standing policy not to make determinations in relation to genocide. The differences between Truss and Wilson were quickly noticed by Chinese media. The nationalist Global Times wrote an opinion piece early this week that the UK's hawkish politicians, such as Liz Truss, turn black to white. So firstly, John, looking at the media for a moment, as Liz Truss is regarded as a hawkish member of the cabinet, is it any surprise that an official Chinese paper is making fun of her? After all, the Sun and the Mail and the Express do exactly the same thing here about non-British politicians.
No, it's not surprising, and equally, it's not surprising that an ambassador would maybe go slightly native. It happens all the time, when they've been there for a while, and especially when they speak Mandarin and they're active in social media and getting lots of positive feedback from elements of Chinese society, then it's not surprising she's become a friend. I wouldn't personally want to take sides in this. On balance, if I had to choose to live in Tory England or the current Chinese regime, I choose Tory England. I think I might survive a bit better there. But I think it's a difficult one. I mean, I think the idea that this is genocide is a bit exaggerated. I assumed that genocide was an attempt to actually remove a people. What they're doing is appalling. I mean, they're trying to reprogram them and take away their culture. It might be called cultural genocide. I don't think it's genocide in the classic sense. No, it's all very predictable and quite entertaining that the Chinese, as you say, know about Little Britain. I didn't realise they saw that.
Good point. Now, the UK government and Prime Minister Boris Johnson have to tread a delicate balance here, as we've been discussing, between underscoring the need for maintaining cooperation with China, a global superpower, and criticising its human rights record. Now, John, do you think there's any prospects of such skilled and world-renowned political and diplomatic operators as Boris Johnson and Liz Truss? Is there any chance of them treading anything delicately?
No, I don't think so. Although I think they're very capable of changing their minds when things, when the going gets tough. They really will just flip around. And I don't think they would. I mean, there's an element of show in this confrontation, this notion of confrontation with China. As you say, a massive superpower these days, and we represent a very, very declining sort of former superpower. So I think we need to learn our limits a bit, and by all means, we should campaign along with the various groups who are campaigning against the apparent cultural genocide in that part of China. You'll notice I've avoided pronouncing it, but at the same time, I think a degree of pragmatism is called for here, and an attempt to maintain at least tolerable relationships with China, I think, is essential for us.
That's a good point, John. And just finally on this story, it crossed my mind that perhaps this story is as much and the goings on behind it are as much for domestic consumption in the UK as anything else. I'm reminded that the very large aircraft carrier, the Queen Elizabeth, Big Liz, along with a carrier fleet, are currently sailing around the South China Sea, much to the annoyance of the Chinese. So do you think, is this just Liz trying to piggyback a little bit on what the Ministry of Defence are doing?
Yes, well, I think it was Gavin Williamson, another somewhat undereducated minister, who sent the aircraft carrier. I think it's called a task force or a carrier group or something. Sent them to South China Sea. I think maybe before they had any aeroplanes. I think when they just had helicopters, and it was I think it was probably laughed at quite a bit by the Chinese. So, and I see they've lost a plane in the Med now. That one of these very expensive F-35s hasn't managed to land on the deck of one of these. Is it? Do they only have one aircraft carrier or two? I can never remember.
There,
Massive
there
sort
are,
of white
there are,
elephants.
yeah, there are two now. There's the Prince of Wales as well.
Ah, very impressive.
That's the ones you can tell. I can see Rosyth out the back of the house here because I've watched
Ah,
them both being built. That's why I know. But actually, we'll stay at sea with our next story because Denmark has accused the UK of breaching the post-Brexit fisheries deal over plans to ban bottom trawling at the Dogger Bank Conservation Zone in the North Sea, a move hailed by environmentalists hoping to see a resurgence of halibut, sharks, and skate in the once marine life-rich sandbank. Speaking to The Guardian, Denmark's Fisheries Minister Rasmus Prehn said such plans were not in line with the post-Brexit deal. The Brexit agreement ensures full access for EU vessels to fish in UK waters until 2026, and therefore, of course, it is a very big problem for us if the UK government is going to change that. We find that unacceptable and it's a breach of our agreement, he said. The charge opens a new front for the UK government, which is already embroiled in a rancorous dispute with France over fishing rights, against a wider backdrop of post-Brexit tensions with the EU. The Dogger Bank is a large, shallow sandbank about 90 miles northeast of the Humber estuary, which has been fished by UK and Danish boats for centuries, and is amongst the country's most important fishing grounds, according to the Danish government. Under the Brexit Trade and Cooperation Agreement struck between the EU and the UK last Christmas Eve, EU fishers can continue to access UK waters as before until the 30th of June 2026, a transition to delay the blow of reduced fishing rights in future. The deal also commits both sides to promoting the long-term sustainability of the 70 common fish in the shared waters. So, John, firstly, notoriously, Johnson blethered on about Dogger Bank in a set-piece interview with CNN during COP26, and an interview which was not compared favourably with an interview given by the First Minister to CNN the day before. So the appearance of Dogger Bank in the press today, is this announcement just a hangover from his performance over the past couple of weeks?
I don't know, but the Dogger Bank story, I mean, is an interesting one. I mean, clearly it makes a very lot of sense that we should protect that particular fishing ground. I mean, it does sound like it's at risk here. The Danes, no doubt, are correct in that we almost certainly signed up to allow that to continue, and now we seem to be changing our minds. And whether the Conservatives are just exploiting the situation or not, I can't imagine that they're philosophically lining themselves up with the groups trying to protect those bottom feeders there. I mean, I can see why the Tories would be interested in protecting bottom feeders.
Well, there is that, John. So there's one other, in terms of the politics of this, I was going to ask you as well whether this might be another example of the UK government making announcements blithely without it thinking through the ramifications. So let me paint a scenario for you. Johnson unilaterally bans this sort of trawling in UK waters. Denmark and perhaps the rest of the EU respond by preventing UK registered trawlers from landing in EU ports, something that they're doing a great deal at the moment because of the logistics and paperwork problems at Dover and other UK export ports. These UK boats then have nowhere sensible to land their catches and have to tie up. So two questions there. Do you think the ramifications are thought through before these announcements are made? And do you think will there be any Scottish fishing industry left once all of these Brexit bonuses have been delivered?
Yes, it's looking very, very, very negative indeed. And as you say, probably not thought through. I mean, I think there's history here of especially the Johnson regime doing things for effect and doing things very quickly to try and score points. It's clearly a no-win situation. We can stop them. We can stop the European Union countries fishing in UK waters. But if we do that and they put a ban on us actually landing the fish that we collect in their harbours, then the whole thing's going to collapse, and both sides will suffer. And as you point out, the Scottish fish industry, quite important, will suffer more than others.
And a broader political point just crosses my mind as well. I often describe Johnson as being perhaps the most intensely transactional prime minister we've had for many, many years. So it seems curious that these announcements emerge without the ramifications or without the costs and the benefits having been worked through politically. Do you think this indicates that government departments are just operating beyond the reach of Downing Street?
Yes, I'd imagine it's a bit of a hands-off situation. I mean, he's renowned for being lazy, for not being interested, and for not knowing his brief, as they say, but then saying things. So that inevitably, I think, leads departments at times to fill the gap, to fill the power void, or the power vacuum, I should say, and actually start to make decisions themselves and to push things through that haven't been properly thought out.
Well, certainly the circumstances relating to Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, who we've been speaking about this week already, are perhaps one of the most egregious examples of the Johnsonian approach that you mentioned there. But we'll move on to talk about another Conservative politician, because a Conservative Party donor who had supported Michael Gove's leadership bid is reported to have been awarded a £164 million COVID contract. David Mellor, who co-owned Mellor Designs during the pandemic, was awarded 6 personal protective equipment (PPE) supply contracts from the Department of Health and Social Care after Mr Gove referred the firm to a VIP lane. Coincidentally, Mr Mellor had previously donated nearly £60,000 to the Tory party, including £3,250 to support Mr Gove's party leadership bid in 2016. Mr Gove is also prominent as the Cabinet Minister leading the Westminster Government's anti-independence campaign, which has reportedly seen him reach out to the likes of George Galloway. The revelations follow on from details published yesterday by Politico, which found numerous firms who had links to Tory figures had secured lucrative contracts throughout the pandemic, inevitably including Tory peer Baroness Mone. Commenting, the SNP shadow leader in the House of Commons, Pete Wishart MP, said, "This Tory party are quite simply rotten to the core. With each day that passes, more examples of Tory sleaze, corruption and cronyism come to light, with Mr Gove now the latest to be under scrutiny." So, John, Mellor Designs made a profit of £13 million after tax in 2020. The year before it managed £144,000. The director of the Good Law Project, Joe Maugham, has said with his characteristic lawyerly understatement, "This is really ugly stuff." And Alex Runswick, who's a senior advocacy manager at Transparency International UK, said, "When lucrative deals are awarded to those with political connections without competition, taxpayer money could easily be wasted. With more spent on PPE than the annual budget of the Home Office, the public have a right to know if their money was spent wisely and properly, along with wider scrutiny of the response." So, where do you think this is heading in terms of the Category 5 political storm with Johnson at its centre? Now that the connection between corruption and senior ministers is being more clearly, do you think that the overarching storm that's surrounding the Tories will stick around for a few more weeks?
I wouldn't want to tempt fate here, but there has to come a point. This is catastrophe capitalism. When opportunities present themselves, when most of the population is suffering, then one or two, or maybe a few thousand, ruthless capitalists take advantage. And sometimes those capitalists are also members of the government. And the VIP lane is obviously a fast track to the gravy train here. It looks from the opinion polls as if it's starting to hit home. We've had maybe 3 polls now with Labour ahead. But of course, the very, very weak appeal of Sir Keir Starmer is, I think, limiting that. I think with a stronger Labour leader, I think we might have seen a much more worrying situation. But of course, they have some time to go before another election need be called. But it does look as if we may have reached a tipping point where the public is saying enough is enough. This has gone on too far, because all abuses of this kind do eventually stop.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. Now, we'll move away from politics again because SSE has unveiled an ambitious £12.5 billion capital investment plan to accelerate progress towards net zero. The company, which is currently building more offshore wind than anyone else in the world, including the world's largest offshore wind farm at Dogger Bank, and owns and operates 3 of the UK's electricity networks, will increase its capital investment by 2/3, £1 billion more annually, to support the global push to decarbonise. The significant commitment comes just days after the curtain closed on COP26 in Glasgow, and SSE says it's putting its money where its mouth is on delivering tangible solutions to help deliver on the summit commitments. The new programme will see SSE enable delivery of over a quarter of the UK's 40 gigawatts of offshore wind target by 2030, and over 20% of the necessary upcoming electricity network investment in the UK, as well as continuing its international expansion. By 2026, SSE says its Net Zero Acceleration Programme will deliver £1 billion of additional capital investment per year, a doubling of existing renewables net installed capacity to 8 gigawatts, a sustainable renewables development pipeline in excess of 15 gigawatts, and over 2.5 times more capital allocated to renewables growth. SSE has also confirmed revised greenhouse gas emission targets aligned with a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway, backed by the Science Based Target Initiative. Its new targets for Scope 1 and Scope 2 absolute emissions cut in half the previously planned emissions for 2030. So, John, firstly, we've heard a little bit in the press over the last 10 days or so about large energy players in the energy markets, principally big oil, but now electricity generators too, starting to talk about what they're doing and starting to talk about the need for these businesses to be kept in one piece in order to be able to afford the capital investment that they are planning. So do you think that, curiously, as one of the results of COP26 is that big energy firms like the big oil companies and also major generators like SSE, that in fact their position has been strengthened rather than weakened after COP26?
Yes, again, there's a kind of predictability in this, that a point would come when these massive corporations, which make massive profits out of the supply of energy, electricity and gas to the population, make huge profits, that they would detect the point at which it's time to change horses. And they have the money to do it because they're charged so much, they make huge profits, that they will move fairly quickly from oil and gas to renewables and still be in charge and still be making the money. I think that was inevitable. These companies have, employ some really kind of, top experts in predicting what will happen with the economy, and I think they'll be ready to just change horses and be in charge again.
That's a very good point. Excuse me. Excuse me, John. That's a very good point that you make there. One other thing that crossed my mind in connection with SSE and their announcements today, and which connects to some of the discussions that we've had already this evening, and I think we will have later on in the programme, it talks about SSE's Just Transition Plan, outlining 20 principles that the company will follow, it says, to ensure that all communities benefit from the journey to net zero, prioritising good green jobs, consumer fairness, building and operating new assets, looking after people in high carbon jobs, and supporting communities. To your point about these large organisations pivoting quickly in order to maintain their position, do you think that we can rely on big companies like SSE to deliver the just transition that we need? And do you think that how important do you think just transition plans like this one are going to be as more and more of these programs are announced in the energy sector?
Yes, I mean, trust is maybe not the word I would use. I take a more cynical view of things, but they have the muscle and they have the expertise, and to make that transition. And how just it is another matter. It will certainly be a transition where they will make some effort, I think, to limit job losses as we get across to the other side. I think that there's no chance at all that the people of Scotland will benefit from this transition in terms of lower energy costs. Renewables may be cheap, but you can be sure they won't be cheap for us.
Absolutely, John. Thank you. And just in passing, given it's come up twice this evening, do you think that the sea life living on the Dogger Bank appreciate just how much attention they're getting in the press today?
I'd imagine they will if they've heard about it. I mean, there are so many obvious similarities between some of these bottom feeders and some of the people running our country at the moment.
I'll set them up, John, and you knock them down. We'll move on now to our next story, which is that at least one person has been killed and several more are feared dead after a huge storm in the Pacific Northwest, destroying highways and leaving tens of thousands of people in Canada and the US without power. Canada's largest port was cut off by floodwaters as emergency crews in British Columbia announced on Tuesday that at least 10 vehicles had been swept off a highway during a landslide. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police confirmed a woman's body was recovered from the site of the landslide during a search the previous night. Search crews working alongside the military planned to use heavy equipment and dog teams to continue their search for survivors after poor weather continued to hamper their efforts. On Monday, rescue helicopters airlifted 275 people, including 50 children, from a section of the highway blocked by landslides. Although the high winds and the rains caused by an atmospheric river, a huge plume of moisture extending over the Pacific, began easing in the region, large areas of southern British Columbia remained under either flood watch or flood warning. South of the border, tens of thousands of households and businesses remain without power in Washington state. Nearly 50,000 Washington state electrical customers still had no power on Tuesday after days of heavy rain triggered mudslides and floods and forced the closure of the West Coast's main north-south highway near the Canadian border, officials said. The Washington governor, Jay Inslee, declared a severe weather state of emergency in 14 counties and said the State Emergency Management Division, with support from the Washington National Guard, would coordinate the response. Earlier in the day, the Port of Vancouver, the largest in Canada, announced that all rail access had been cut by floods and landslides further to the east, a development that could hit shipments of grain, coal and potash. The Trans Mountain Pipeline, which carries 300,000 barrels of oil a day, was also shut down. So, John, the mayor of the town of Abbotsford, a chap called Henry Braun, said, "This is an uncertain and scary time for people who are affected. They don't understand what's happening and what the future will be." Now, that struck me as perhaps being relevant for every single citizen everywhere on the planet as the effects of global warming become clearer. So, is this simply an example of the sort of effects and impacts we are likely to see worldwide?
Well, there seems to be fairly unanimous opinion that this is to do with global warming, with climate change, and I wouldn't dream of saying otherwise. I think it's maybe slightly more complex in terms of how people react and how governments react to all of this. I mean, one person dead is of course tragic for that family, but it's quite a small number of dead for that kind of phenomenon. Had it been somewhere else, had that been the west coast of Africa, thousands would have died, maybe hundreds of thousands would have died. It's tragic. Canada has an advanced infrastructure. It's an affluent country, so they survive quite well. And the way that the Japanese survive earthquakes, I can't help but think though there's something more to this, and that's the fact that these places where we're having extreme weather are places that a few hundred years ago people of European ancestry didn't live. And I read a book in the 90s by a man called Mike Davis of one of the California universities called The Ecology of Fear, in which he predicted this kind of thing. And he pointed out that there are two kinds of climate, and that most of the people living in, say, Canada and California are descended from people who lived in Northern Europe, or maybe even Central Europe, where they have a high frequency, low intensity weather. It's always changing, but it's never very extreme, nothing very dramatic. And they've moved to live in an area like the west coast of the United States, like southern Australia, like parts of the Mediterranean, which is low frequency, high intensity. In other words, things don't change, sometimes for decades, sometimes for centuries. Things don't change much. Then when they do change, it's extreme. And the people who live there are of a cultural mindset that say, oh, this is extreme.
Absolutely, John. Thank you. That's a very good point that you're making. One other thing, just with regard to this story, I'm also aware that this part of southern British Columbia is, as you would expect, an extremely agricultural part of the world. And I was struck that the mayor and one of the governors had pointed out that the water that's now lying in these areas is toxic. Several plants which process and manufacture manure have been inundated with water as a result of the extreme flooding, and as a result, the water that's surrounding people is not safe. And so, whereas those who've not been affected might expect that you would paddle away or walk away, there are significant health threats to health being presented by the water that's inundated. And it just struck me: does that suggest that at least in part, the model of agriculture that's being used is now becoming insufficiently resilient for the sort of weather events that we are going to begin to encounter?
Yeah. I mean, some of these dramatic weather events, I don't think you could, in any reasonable way, expect the systems that you have to be able to cope with them because they're so extreme. It just wouldn't be cost effective if they're not going to happen for maybe for 100 years at a time. Then you can't afford to do that. I mean, we have that situation in the UK. We have it in Scotland, where occasionally sewage is dumped into the rivers. Happens in Scotland. Happens far more often in England. I do wonder if the water in Canada is any worse than the water in many English rivers and lakes at the moment, after the Tories voted to dump sewage in huge quantities.
That's a very fair point, and also, as you say, officials have described the events in British Columbia and Washington State as a once in a century weather event, and so the point that you make there is very valid. Although I remember some of the flood prevention measures that are being built in Ayrshire at the moment are intended to deal with flooding events that are 1 in 250 years. So I wonder if the planning envelope, if I can call it that, is now changing, and we are beginning to invest in defences and other measures to deal with events that are even more, that previously have been even rarer.
Yeah, I think the situation in Scotland, and it'll probably be the same in other areas with a very wet climate, maybe parts of Scandinavia too, is that regulations for a very long time have stopped people building in floodplains and also have insisted in better drainage, as in the case. There are parts of the south of England where they're building on the floodplains, where the building regulations are much more loose because they've had a dry climate for a while, and they're experiencing that now. So these things change.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. So now we'll return to Scotland for our next story, which is that women will be able to access a temporary 3-month supply of the progesterone-only contraceptive pill from community pharmacies. Also known as the mini pill, the national rollout follows a successful pilot in pharmacies across Lothian and Tayside. This step will complement existing services currently providing contraception to widen access and bridge the gap between emergency contraception and the use of longer-term contraception. Patients will be advised to contact their own GP practice or sexual health service for ongoing contraception. The Scottish Government says their UK-leading women's health plan, that ensuring women have the support they need to manage and improve their own health, including providing them with a choice of contraceptive options, is the first step to a women's health and wellbeing service in community pharmacies. So, John, when the Women's Health Plan was launched in August, the Women's Health Minister, Marie Todd, said, "Women's health is not just a women's issue. When women and girls are supported to lead healthy lives and fulfill their potential, the whole of society benefits." So does this, of which today's announcement about availability of contraception, does this signal a significant shift in attitude, perhaps recognising the wider societal benefits that accrue from addressing some fundamental health issues?
Yes, I have to say, it's difficult to keep up with everything. I have to say, I was shocked to discover that women hadn't been able to just go in and buy these products for the last 40 years or something. I'm absolutely horrified that we're still in a situation where a doctor can decide whether or not a woman can have access to these things. It's almost, I remember the situation in the early 70s where a girlfriend of mine was refused by her doctor. The doctor just decided she wasn't old enough.
It's astonishing, John. We can only hope that this announcement today, as I say, is part of a much wider approach. The Women's Health Plan is part of a wider work being undertaken across the Scottish Government. Women and girls' mental health are a priority within the Mental Health Transition and Recovery Plan. Violence against women and girls is being tackled through the implementation of an equally safe strategy. And the Gender Pay Gap Action Plan is driving forward changes needed to reduce the gender pay gap for employees in Scotland. So is that kind of joined up approach across a number of fronts something that we need to see more of in Scotland from the government?
Yeah, I mean, I think you would have to say, although it's probably much overdue, all of it overdue, that at least this current Scottish government does seem to have a grasp of the whole thing. Anna Sarr was always telling them to get a grip, but I would say they have a grip much better than any government we've had before. And as you say, these are all interlinked, and they're all overdue. And the idea that women have had to beg for these things is just disgraceful.
Thanks, John. Our next story remains on matters green, because the next steps in creating a circular economy in Scotland have been announced today, as the Circular Economy Minister, Lorna Slater, provided an update to Parliament. Actions include the appointment of waste and sustainability expert Dr. Colin Church as an independent chair of the review into the role of incineration in the waste hierarchy in Scotland. To support the review, which forms part of the cooperation deal with the Scottish Green Party, the Minister announced that planning authorities must now notify Scottish ministers of any applications or decisions involving incineration facilities until the end of the review period. The Minister also announced the first round of funding through the Scottish Government's £70 million Recycling Improvement Fund. Over £7 million has been awarded to 7 local authorities to increase recycling while preparing for future developments, including Scotland's Deposit Return Scheme. The Minister provided an update on the delivery of the scheme, noting the challenges posed by Brexit, the pandemic, and a lack of clarity from the UK government on the VAT treatment of deposits. The Circular Economy Minister Lorna Slater said, "A circular economy is at the heart of Scotland's response to the climate emergency and will help dramatically reduce the amount of waste generated in Scotland. We must also find better ways to deal with the waste in our economy, the waste our economy is currently creating. That's why I'm pleased that Dr. Colin Church will bring his wealth of experience from across the waste and environmental sectors to our review on the role of incineration." So, John, I'll not ask you to comment on detailed green policies relating to recycling. However, I will talk a little bit about the politics of this. Greenpeace did a study recently which found that areas of the UK in the top 20% for deprivation host more than a third of the country's incinerators. Now, and whilst there's an argument that incinerators in poorer areas of the country provide jobs, of course, those jobs tend to be relatively short term, while the environmental impacts can be permanent. So, do you think there's a class element here? Do you think there's a wider societal issue here in terms of the way in which we approach incineration in our environment?
I think that's a long-standing problem, and it applies not just to waste management or to incineration. It applies to to sewage treatment or to even just factories. I mean, you tend to see a very strong correlation between the poorest communities and the most polluting industries located right next to them. We try and move something like a sewage treatment plant to a more kind of middle class area and watch the media campaign develop. We've seen that in Ayr, where a sewage treatment plant was due to be located at the south end of the town in one of the more affluent areas, and then after a very powerful campaign, it was moved to the more impoverished northern part of the town. So
Ayrshire, I was actually going to ask, as our resident Ayrshire expert, I was actually going to ask you about that point. The perhaps a deeper issue even still is that what this incinerator planning application process reveals about the planning system. Why are incinerators, open cast mines, and other industrial sites more common in places like East Ayrshire Is it because the developers assume that the residents are less likely or able to protest? Or is it because there's a bias at the heart of the planning system that avoids better off areas, or those resident at better off areas are more able to protest? And of course, these are areas where we just have to face it, where the people who own the businesses that run the mines or run the incinerators are more likely to live.
I think it's a mix of all those things. I think that they're all important factors, and it certainly would be the case in places, parts of East Ayrshire. Well, first of all, the coal is there, of course, and that's obviously a factor. Where is the coal? But these impoverished communities are, have high levels of unemployment, and it's unlikely that they would campaign against such a development because they see the rather important to them opportunities for work. So that it's understandable. I think it's a complex picture, but it clearly contains within it considerable areas of unfairness.
Thanks, John. And thinking also in connection with this story about the circular economy more clearly, I'll not bracket you in this, but certainly in my own case, I'm old enough to remember milk being delivered in recyclable glass bottles, either by electric milk floats or by, in my case, horse-drawn milk floats from Cuthbert's Dairy in Edinburgh. And I'm also able to remember collecting Iron Brew have had enough press this week, ginger bottles, and recovering the deposit on them myself. So what do you think it says about where we currently are, that all of these approaches that used to form a basic part of our daily lives, it seems to be a struggle to get them reintroduced?
Yes, I mean that one's been much talked about. The milk floats running on renewable electricity, and with the bottles that get washed out and then used again. I'm I may be slightly biased here. I'm a wee bit lactose intolerant, so I haven't enthused about that particular one. I mean, there has been tremendous progress. There has been tremendous progress. And when I say progress, not everyone would agree. I have 7 wheelie bins in my drive, 7 wheelie bins, and I faithfully go out and spend a bit of time, putting things in the right wheelie bin. That's not counting the food bin, so there are 8 altogether. I mean, that clearly is progress that we're doing that. I think what's holding it all back a bit is you'll not be surprised to hear me say is the lack of devolution of the overall picture here. The opportunities for the Scottish Government to take charge of the whole thing, also to have borrowing powers, to be able to gather the VAT, because at the moment we've got no idea where the VAT is going and how much there is and so on. So the picture of Scotland's economy is really quite lacking in detail. I think if we had, independence would obviously be a step to many things. And I think in terms of the environment and Scotland's role in improving the environment, I think independence is a necessary first step.
Absolutely, John. Thank you. And our final story this evening is also a green story, because an additional £18 million will be available this year to help householders install energy-efficient measures and reduce their heating bills, bringing the total support available through Home Energy Scotland to £50 million in 2021-22. People are being urged to seek support and advice from Home Energy Scotland to help make their homes warmer and reduce their heating bills on average by up to £300. Financial support worth up to £5,000 is also available to make homes more energy efficient through improvements like home insulation, double glazing, or a new heating system. Home Energy Scotland also supports households with practical advice and, where appropriate, install energy efficient measures, making homes more energy efficient and saving householders money. The Minister for Zero Carbon Buildings, Patrick Harvey MSP, said, "As the colder weather returns and given the concern around rising energy bills, we want to ensure that people are aware of the support available to keep their homes warm this winter. Home Energy Scotland offers advice, support and funding to help people make energy-saving improvements, helping them reduce their energy costs. The free, impartial advice and support is available for anyone concerned about paying their energy bills, and we would urge people struggling with their fuel bills to get in touch with Home Energy Scotland." So, John, firstly, I looked at the Home Energy Scotland website earlier this evening, and for my postcode, I found that there's financial support and assistance available for a renewable heat incentive, which pays you for putting renewable energy back into the grid. Loan for private rented sector landlords to help them improve the energy efficiency of their properties, a smart export guarantee, which is financial support for small scale generators of renewables who want to put money into the grid, the Warmer Homes Scotland scheme, which provides free installation of a range of energy saving measures for vulnerable homeowners and private sector tenants who struggle to heat their home and who meet the qualifying criteria, and also the Home Energy Scotland loan, which is an interest-free loan by the government to help make energy-saving improvements to your home. So that was just for my postcode. But do you think that list, does that give an indication of the breadth and the depth of the challenges, and also the breadth and depth of the resources which will be required to meet the challenges that we're facing just now?
Yeah, I think all of those things you've described are creditable, and the Scottish Government is due credit for pushing ahead on these things. But as we talked about earlier, the huge energy providers, these massive corporations, which will be able to invest enormous amounts of money in the transition from oil and gas to renewables, and so that they can then still be in charge and still charge us all as much as they would like to do. They It's not in their interest to see houses particularly well insulated. They want to sell energy to us. So the impetus for improving the houses and to reduce the energy consumption must come from government, and government must have then access to the same kind of financial resources that the energy providers have. That would mean, again, I return to it, that would mean the ability to borrow very large amounts of money, which we would recoup in the future, and only that can only be done again with independence, I think.
No, that's a very fair point, John. And of course, as we've mentioned on this program over the last 2 weeks, I'm pretty sure it was Shell that had disclosed that their profits have increased to £1 billion by £1 billion a quarter as the energy prices have leapt. And it's striking that the UK government, which has intervened in the oil sector before, both taxing and then reducing taxes, it's striking that this Tory government seems unwilling to get involved with the oil industry.
Yes, well, it's the revolving door, isn't it? I mean, a minister for energy, I think, when they retire, is quite likely to end up on the board of an energy provider. There's no interest in this Eton-based cabinet to be taxing their pals in the boards of major corporations. It's just not going to happen. And also, of course, if they tax them too heavily, it makes the Scottish economy look too strong, and that's another thing they don't want to see happen. So. Yeah, I mean, the point is that the scale of things. You talked there about some of these initiatives, and they're in the millions. But changing Scotland so that it heats its homes efficiently is not going to be in the millions. It's going to be in the billions, and lots of them. And so the only way we can do that is if we start taxing these corporations and also have the ability to borrow.
That's a good point that you make, John. I was reflecting earlier, in clearly in a very weak moment. I had commented on a Facebook page, which is something that I know I should never do, but it must have been a weak moment, and I did, and I found myself embroiled in a very agitated conversation about the challenges which we all face as occupiers of homes in Scotland in terms of making our homes more energy efficient and better insulated, and thereby reducing our impact on climate change. And a number of people were commenting about the challenges of improving the insulation, in particular in our Georgian and Victorian built environment, both in terms of the complexity of some Georgian buildings, but also, I think, also reflecting the very poor quality of some of the Victorian buildings, especially in our more industrial areas. So that struck me as indicating just the extent of the challenges that everybody who occupies a property is going to face, both financially and practically, in terms of beginning to make the changes that we need to make. So do you think is enough being done to begin to address just the extent of the challenges which every home in the country is going to have to make?
I don't think there are other. I mean, in Scotland, there aren't the resources at the level of government to actually make the investment on a level required to transform our housing so that we're not spending huge amounts heating them. I think that it's going to require a huge investment. It's the same with the transition to electric vehicles. I mean, there's a lot of commendable developments there, but it's still a tiny percentage of vehicles with not that long to go until supposedly they'll all be electric. Again, that's going to take enormous investment, and the only way and the corporations won't do that because they lose money. So we're going to tax the corporations and borrow money, and governments do it, but the Tory government won't do that.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. And that was our final item this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the financial support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us financially, and we really need that support, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You'll see the link to do that on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be here again tomorrow evening with Scotland at 7, so please join us then. I'd like to say very many thanks to Professor John Robertson for joining us this evening.
My pleasure.
Thanks, John, and thanks to everyone for joining us here today. So that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. Please keep warm and keep well. Bye-bye.